In the winter of 1941, the British Admiralty was staring into the abyss. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just being lost. It was being massacred. German U-boat wolf packs were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be built, and the Royal Navy, steeped in 300 years of tradition, was fighting a war of intuition, guts, and seamanship. They believed that hunting a submarine was an art form, a duel between captains. They believed that victory belonged to the side with the most courage. They were wrong. The solution to the U-boat crisis didn't come from a fleet admiral. It didn't come from a new destroyer class or a revolutionary new torpedo. It came from a room full of biologists, physicists, and mathematicians who had never fired a gun in anger. This is the story of a group of civilian scientists who looked at the war not as a battle of courage, but as a math problem. They didn't use sonar. They used statistics. They didn't use depth charges. They used probability theory. And when they were done, they didn't just win the Battle of the Atlantic. They proved that the British High Command had been fighting the war completely wrong. To understand the magnitude of this achievement, you first have to understand the catastrophe of 1941. The German U-boat arm, under Admiral Karl Dönitz, had perfected the wolf pack tactic. They didn't attack submerged during the day, as the Royal Navy expected. They attacked on the surface, at night, inside the convoy formation. They slashed through the merchant lines like wolves in a sheep pen. The Royal Navy's response was driven by what they called the Nelsonian tradition: aggression, intuition, the belief that a convoy was safer if it was small, because it was harder to spot, the belief that aircraft should be painted black to hide in the night sky, the belief that a depth charge should explode deep underwater to catch a diving sub. Every single one of these beliefs was wrong. Not just slightly off mathematically, catastrophically wrong. The Admiralty was making decisions based on common sense. But in the counterintuitive physics of modern warfare, common sense was getting sailors killed by the thousands. Into this vacuum of logic stepped Patrick Maynard Stewart Blackett. Blackett was a former naval officer turned physicist. He was a future Nobel Prize winner. He was a man who believed that there was no such thing as the fog of war, only a lack of data. In 1941, he was appointed as the scientific advisor to RAF Coastal Command. He looked at the flailing efforts of the anti-submarine war and realized that the military was trying to solve a physics equation by guessing. He assembled a team that would become legendary. They were officially known as the Operational Research Section. But to the skeptical, hidebound officers of the Admiralty, they were simply Blackett's circus. A composition of the circus was, to the military mind, absurd. It included Evan James Williams, a Welsh physicist who specialized in atomic particles. It included C.H. Waddington, a biologist who studied genetics. It included physiologists, astrophysicists, and surveyors. What did a geneticist know about hunting submarines? Blackett's insight was that war is a system. Just as a biologist studies the ecosystem of a fruit fly to understand its survival rates, a mathematician can study the ecosystem of a convoy to understand its survival rates. The Admiralty saw a battle as a series of heroic individual actions. Blackett saw it as a statistical trend. The officers at Coastal Command headquarters in Northwood initially viewed these civilians with suspicion. They were boffins, men in gray flannel trousers who asked annoying questions and demanded access to secret operational logs. They didn't salute. They worked in a chaotic office filled with cigarette smoke and chalkboard dust. But they had one weapon the admirals didn't: the scientific method. And the first myth they targeted was the small convoy fallacy. For the first 2 years of the war, the Admiralty doctrine was clear. Small convoys are safer. The logic seemed sound. A convoy of 20 ships covers less ocean than a convoy of 60 ships. Therefore, it should be harder for a U-boat to spot. The Admiralty limited convoy sizes, believing they were minimizing the target profile. Blackett's team didn't accept the logic. They pulled the data. They analyzed the records of hundreds of convoy battles. And they found a startling statistical anomaly. The data showed that the number of ships sunk in a convoy battle was roughly constant, regardless of the size of the convoy. Whether the convoy had 20 ships or 60 ships, the wolf pack usually managed to sink the same number, about 3 or 4 vessels, before the escorts drove them off or they ran out of torpedoes. This led to a realization that shattered naval doctrine. If a wolf pack sinks 4 ships out of a convoy of 20, you have lost 20% of your cargo. If a wolf pack sinks 4 ships out of a convoy of 60, you have lost only 6.7% of your cargo. Then they applied geometry. The area of a convoy, the number of ships, increases by the square of the radius. But the perimeter of the convoy, the edge that needs to be protected by destroyers, only increases linearly. This meant that if you doubled the number of ships in a convoy, you didn't need double the number of escort ships to protect it. You only needed a few more. Blackett's team proved that by merging 2 small convoys into one massive convoy, you effectively doubled the density of the escort screen. A U-boat trying to penetrate a screen of 6 destroyers might succeed. A U-boat trying to penetrate a screen of 12 destroyers was suicidal. And the argument about spotting? The math showed that a convoy of 60 ships is only slightly larger in radius than a convoy of 40. In the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean, the difference in visibility was negligible. The Admiralty resisted. They argued that large convoys were unwieldy. They argued that maneuvering 60 merchant ships was a nightmare, but the numbers were irrefutable. When the Admiralty finally adopted the large convoy doctrine, losses plummeted. The Boffins had just saved hundreds of ships, not by inventing a new weapon, but by doing a math problem. But Blackett's circus wasn't done. They turned their eyes to the sky. RAF Coastal Command had been flying anti-submarine patrols since the start of the war. Their aircraft were painted black on the undersides. The logic again was common sense. They were night bombers. Black hides in the dark. Therefore, black paint makes them invisible. But the circus asked a simple question. When are the U-boats spotting us? They analyzed the mission logs. They found that while the planes were indeed flying at night, the critical moments, the attacks on surfaced U-boats, often happened in the twilight or under the gray overcast skies of the North Atlantic day. Evan James Williams, the team's physicist, looked at the optical physics. Against a dark night sky, black is good. But the Atlantic sky isn't black. It is a constant, shifting gray. Cloud cover, mist, whitecaps. Williams realized that a black airplane against a gray sky is a high-contrast silhouette. It stands out like a fly on a white sheet. German lookouts were spotting the black RAF bombers miles away, giving the U-boat plenty of time to crash dive before the plane could attack. The circus proposed a radical change. Paint the undersides of the aircraft white. Specifically, a matte white to minimize reflection. The RAF pilots hated it. They felt naked. They thought they would be targets. But the circus ran a controlled experiment. They measured the distance at which a black plane could be spotted versus a white plane. The results were staggering. The white camouflage reduced the detection range by 20%. That 20% difference was the difference between life and death. It allowed the aircraft to get 20% closer before the Germans sounded the alarm. That meant the U-boat had less time to dive. The number of successful attacks skyrocketed. The white paint scheme effectively doubled the lethality of the air patrols without adding a single new gun or engine. They had weaponized the color spectrum. The greatest triumph of Blackett's circus, however, was the solution to the depth charge dilemma. By 1941, Coastal Command pilots were frustrated. They were finding U-boats. They were dropping depth charges. But they weren't sinking them. The kill rate was abysmal. Something like 1% of attacks resulted in a sinking. The standard depth charge setting was 100 feet. The logic of the 100-foot setting was based on the assumption that by the time the aircraft saw the U-boat and lined up its attack run, the submarine would have spotted the plane and dived. The Admiralty assumed the sub would be well underwater around 50 to 100 feet down by the time the explosives hit the water. Common sense, right? If the enemy dives, you blow him up deep. Evan James Williams looked at the attack logs. He categorized every single attack based on the position of the U-boat at the moment of the drop. The data revealed a shocking reality. In 40% of attacks, the U-boat was still visible on the surface, or had just submerged. In these cases, the U-boat was at a depth of maybe 10 or 20 feet. But the depth charges were set to explode at 100 feet. The pilots were dropping their payloads right on top of the enemy, but the charges were waiting too long to detonate. They were exploding harmlessly deep in the abyss, while the U-boat escaped with a few rattled rivets. But what about the other 60% of cases where the U-boat had dived deep? Williams analyzed the hydrodynamics of a diving submarine. He calculated that if a U-boat had been submerged long enough to reach 100 feet, the uncertainty of its position, its area of probability, was so large that dropping a depth charge blindly was statistically useless anyway. The conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. If the U-boat is deep, you are going to miss it anyway, because you don't know where it is horizontally. If the U-boat is shallow, you know exactly where it is, but your weapon is set too deep to kill it. You were designing a weapon for the scenario where you had the lowest chance of hitting, and making it useless for the scenario where you had the highest chance of hitting. Williams recommended changing the depth setting from 100 feet to 25 feet. The Admiralty balked. 25 feet? That was practically surface level. They feared the blast would damage the dropping aircraft. They argued it would let the deep-diving U-boats escape, but Blackett insisted. He pushed the change through. The results were instantaneous. The success rate of air attacks on U-boats increased by a factor of 2.5 times. In the brutal arithmetic of the Battle of the Atlantic, this was the equivalent of doubling the size of the Air Force overnight. But they hadn't built a single new plane. They hadn't trained a single new pilot. They had simply changed a number on a dial. Blackett's circus didn't just solve specific problems. They pioneered a new way of thinking. They called it operational research. Before this, military decisions were based on tradition, rank, and the great man theory of leadership. After Blackett, decisions were based on data density. They applied this logic to everything. They analyzed the maintenance schedules of aircraft. They analyzed the number of rounds fired by anti-aircraft guns. They even analyzed the optimal way to sweep the floor of a factory to minimize dust in gyroscope assembly. But their greatest test was yet to come. In 1943, the Allies prepared to launch the Bay Offensive, a massive effort to hunt U-boats as they crossed the Bay of Biscay. The Admiralty wanted to flood the area with patrols. But Blackett looked at the numbers and realized that the U-boats were adapting. They were surfacing only to recharge batteries. To catch them, the Allies didn't just need more planes. They needed a mathematical model of search theory that could predict exactly where a U-boat would surface based on its battery life and transit speed. This was the birth of the algorithm of death. The Battle of the Bay of Biscay would become the ultimate proving ground for Blackett's theories. It was a contest between German technological adaptation and British mathematical prediction. The U-boats, equipped with METOX radar detectors, believed they were invisible to the older British radar sets. They began to cross the bay with a new confidence, surfacing at night to recharge, their Biscay cross antennas listening for the pulse of the enemy. But they didn't know that the circus had anticipated this. The scientists had analyzed the exchange rate of the war. They knew that for every U-boat sunk, a certain number of Allied merchant ships were saved. They calculated that the most efficient use of a long-range bomber was not to protect a convoy directly, but to patrol the transit routes, the narrow corridors the U-boats had to use to get from their French bases to the open Atlantic. It was a choke point, and Blackett intended to strangle it. But there was a problem. The U-boats were staying submerged during the day and only surfacing at night. Even with radar, finding a tiny conning tower in the vastness of the bay was like finding a needle in a haystack. The pilots were exhausted, staring at blank radar screens for hours. The circus realized they needed to change the variables of the hunt. They needed to turn night into day. This led to the deployment of the Lee Light, a powerful carbon arc searchlight mounted under the wing of a bomber. The tactic was pure physics. The radar would track the U-boat from miles away in the pitch black. The aircraft would approach silently, engines throttled back. Then, at the last second at a range of 1 mile, the pilot would switch on the blinding light. The U-boat crew, their eyes adjusted to the darkness, would be instantly blinded. Before they could even reach the alarm button, the depth charges were bracketing the hull. The introduction of the Lee Light, combined with the 25-foot depth charge setting, turned the Bay of Biscay into a slaughterhouse. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed. It was Black May. Admiral Dunitz, the architect of the U-boat war, was stunned. He wrote in his diary that the Allies must have developed a new mystical detection device. He couldn't believe that simple changes in tactics and existing technology could cause such devastation. He suspended U-boat operations in the North Atlantic. The wolf packs had been broken, not by a new fleet of battleships, but by a team of scientists who realized that painting a plane white and changing a fuse setting could win a war. But the work of the circus wasn't without its internal battles. The most dangerous enemy Blackett faced wasn't the German Navy. It was the British Bomber Command. The head of Bomber Command, Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, was obsessed with the strategic bombing of German cities. He believed that the only way to win the war was to flatten Berlin and Hamburg. He jealously guarded his heavy bombers, the Lancasters and Halifaxes, and refused to release them for anti-submarine duties. Blackett looked at the data. He calculated the marginal utility of a heavy bomber. If a bomber dropped its load on Berlin, it might destroy a few buildings and kill some civilians. The impact on the war effort was statistically negligible. But if that same bomber was patrolling the Atlantic, it could save thousands of tons of vital supplies. Blackett produced a report that was a masterpiece of cold, hard logic. He proved that a single long-range Liberator aircraft patrolling the Atlantic saved 6 Allied merchant ships for every U-boat it forced a dive. He argued that diverting just 2 squadrons of long-range bombers from bombing cities to protecting convoys would save enough food and fuel to keep Britain in the war. Harris was furious. He called the scientists amateur strategists and fought tooth and nail to keep his planes. It took the direct intervention of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, armed with Blackett's graphs and charts, to force the change. The very long-range Liberators were deployed to the Atlantic Gap. The result was the immediate closure of the Black Pit, the area of the mid-Atlantic where U-boats had roamed with impunity. The supply lines were secured. The invasion of Europe became possible. This conflict highlights the true power of operations research. It wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about killing the inefficiency within your own side. It was about telling a 4-star general that his favorite strategy was mathematically illiterate. It required a level of intellectual courage that matched the physical courage of the pilots flying the missions. Another area where the circus applied their forensic mathematics was in the maintenance hangars. In 1942, the RAF was suffering from a chronic shortage of serviceable aircraft. Planes were sitting on the ground, waiting for repairs, while pilots sat in the mess hall. The standard procedure was scheduled maintenance. Every 50 flying hours, a plane was pulled off the line for a complete overhaul. It seemed like a prudent, safety-conscious policy. Cecil Gordon, the geneticist, decided to test this assumption. He looked at the data on engine failures. he found something that defied conventional wisdom. The rate of accidental failures was actually higher immediately after a scheduled maintenance period than it was before. The mechanics, in their zeal to inspect and tighten every bolt, were actually introducing new faults into perfectly working machines. They were stripping threads, pinching wires, and dropping tools. Gordon plotted the survival curve of the engines. He showed that an engine that had run for 50 hours without a problem was statistically likely to run for another 50 hours without a problem. By pulling it apart, the RAF was resetting the clock and exposing the engine to the high-risk infant mortality phase of mechanical reliability. He recommended abolishing the strict 50-hour overhaul and replacing it with a system of planned flying and condition-based maintenance. The engineering officers were apoplectic. They accused the scientists of endangering the lives of the crews. But trials were run. The maintenance intervals were doubled. The result? The serviceability rate of Coastal Command squadrons jumped from 50% to over 60%. It was the equivalent of receiving hundreds of new aircraft for free. The Waddington effect, named after C.H. Waddington, another member of the team, became a foundational concept in modern industrial engineering. They had proven that sometimes the best way to maintain a complex machine is to leave it alone. The legacy of Blackett's Circus extends far beyond World War II. The methods they developed using probability to maximize efficiency, testing assumptions with data, and ignoring rank in favor of evidence became the foundation of modern management science. Today, every time a logistics company routes a delivery truck, every time a hospital schedules a surgery, and every time an investment bank calculates risk, they are using the tools invented by a motley crew of biologists and physicists in a drafty office in 1941. They taught the military a lesson that is still relevant today. In the age of industrial warfare, intuition is a liability. You cannot feel your way to victory. You have to calculate it. The Germans built better tanks. They built better submarines. They had better optical rangefinders. But they lost because they were fighting a war of romance and ideology, while the Allies were fighting a war of logistics and mathematics. The U-boat commander peering through his periscope saw a convoy. Patrick Blackett saw a variable in a probability equation. And in the long run, the equation always wins. The 25-foot depth charge setting was not just a tactical adjustment. It was the triumph of the rational mind over the chaos of battle. It was the moment when the art of war became the science of war, and the wolf packs never stood a chance. But the war of the slide rule was far from over. Having revolutionized the convoy system and the depth charge, Blackett's Circus now turned its gaze toward the most vulnerable point in the U-boat S life cycle, the transit. To reach the hunting grounds of the mid-Atlantic, every U-boat based in France had to cross the Bay of Biscay. It was a funnel, a geographic choke point. The operational research section analyzed the geometry of the bay and calculated what they called surface density. They realized that a submarine, to cover the distance to the Atlantic, had to spend a specific amount of time on the surface, recharging its batteries. The math dictated that if the RAF flooded this specific patch of ocean with patrols, they could force the U-boats to submerge. If a U-boat is forced to submerge frequently, its transit time doubles or triples. Its battery runs flat. It never reaches the convoy lanes. It was a strategy of suppression. There was just one problem: the night. By 1942, German U-boat commanders had learned that the RAF owned the daylight. So they adapted. They stayed submerged during the day, creeping along at 2 knots, and surfaced only at night to run their diesels and recharge their batteries. In the darkness, they felt safe. The primitive radar sets of the time, the ASV Mark II, had a fatal flaw. They could detect a submarine from 10 miles away, but as the aircraft flew closer, the radar signal would get lost in the sea clutter, the reflections from the waves. At about 1 mile from the target, the radar would go blind. Imagine the pilot's frustration. He knows a U-boat is there. He flies toward the blip on his screen. But for the last mile, he is flying blind in pitch blackness. By the time he flies over the target, he can't see it. The roar of his engines warns the U-boat, which crash dives into the safety of the deep. The British were finding the enemy, but they couldn't finish the job. The solution came from a wing commander named Humphrey de Verde-Lee. He wasn't a scientist. He was a personnel officer, but he was a tinkerer. He bolted a massive 22 million candle power naval searchlight to the bottom of a Wellington bomber. The Admiralty was skeptical. They thought the light would just make the plane a target. But Blackett's team ran the numbers. They calculated the time it took for a U-boat to dive versus the speed of the aircraft. They realized that if the pilot switched on the light at exactly the right moment, just as the radar went blind about a mile out, the U-boat crew would be dazzled. They wouldn't have time to man their flak guns. They wouldn't have time to dive. The first trials of the Lee light were terrifyingly effective. A Wellington bomber would track a U-boat in the dark. The German lookouts, relaxing on the conning tower, would hear the drone of engines, but they couldn't see anything. Suddenly, the night would be ripped apart by a blinding beam of white light. The U-boat was pinned against the black water like a moth on a card. Before the German captain could shout an order, depth charges were bracketing the hull. The psychological impact was devastating. German survivor accounts speak of the light of death. The feeling of safety in the darkness was gone. U-boat crews began to suffer from exhaustion because they could never relax. They were being hunted 24 hours a day. But the Germans were engineers too, and they struck back with a piece of technology that nearly neutralized the Lee light, the Metox receiver. The Metox was a radar detector. It was a simple wooden cross strung with wire, known as the Biscay cross, that the Germans mounted on the conning tower. It picked up the pulse of the British ASV radar long before the aircraft was close enough to attack. Now, when a Wellington bomber turned on its radar to hunt, it was essentially broadcasting a warning signal. The U-boat would hear the ping, dive immediately, and by the time the aircraft arrived, the sea was empty. The hunters became the hunted. U-boat losses dropped. The Lee light seemed defeated. This is where the circus earned its pay. They didn't panic. They analyzed the frequency. They realized the Germans were tuning their detectors to the specific wavelength of the current British radar, 1.5 meters. The solution wasn't to stop using radar. It was to change the physics of the radar. British scientists had developed the cavity magnetron, a device that allowed for centimetric radar beams with a wavelength of just 10 centimeters. This was H2S radar. It was so precise it could detect a periscope from miles away. But more importantly, the German Metox receivers couldn't hear it. It was invisible to them. In early 1943, Coastal Command began fitting the new 10-centimeter radar to their planes. The effect was immediate and brutal. The U-boats would be cruising on the surface, their Metox operators listening intently for the 1.5-meter ping. They heard nothing. They felt safe. Then light, explosions, death. The German High Command was baffled. They suspected traitors. They suspected spies. They suspected the British had developed an infrared heat detector. They never suspected that the Allies had simply changed the frequency. It took the Germans months to figure it out, and in those months, the Bay Offensive turned into a slaughter. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed. Admiral Dönitz, the man who had promised to starve Britain into submission, had to withdraw his boats from the North Atlantic. He had been beaten by a searchlight and a magnetron. While the circus was dismantling the U-boat fleet, they were simultaneously fighting a very different battle on the home front. This battle wasn't against the Germans. It was against inefficiency. and the target was anti-aircraft command. During the Blitz of 1940 and 1941, London was defended by thousands of heavy anti-aircraft guns. Every night, they filled the sky with flak. It looked impressive. It sounded defiant. But Blackett's team asked the uncomfortable question, is it actually hitting anything? They gathered the data. The numbers were embarrassing. In the early days of the Blitz, it took an average of 20,000 shells to shoot down a single German bomber. Think about the logistics of that. 20,000 heavy artillery shells. The manufacturing, the transport, the wear on the gun barrels, the manpower. It was unsustainable. The generals argued that the barrage was good for civilian morale. It made people feel defended. Blackett argued that winning the war was better for morale. The circus descended on the gun sites. They didn't look at the guns. They looked at the men. They looked at the predictors, the analog computers used to calculate the aim. They found that the problem wasn't the accuracy of the gun. It was the interface between the man and the machine. The radar operators were trying to track a moving target on a flickering screen while shouting coordinates to a gunner who was trying to crank a handle. It was a game of telephone, played at 300 miles per hour. Blackett's team realized that the crews were consistently making smoothing errors. When a plane zigzagged, the operators tended to smooth out the path in their minds, predicting a straight line where there was a curve. They recommended simple, non-technological changes. They redesigned the dials to be easier to read. They changed the lighting in the radar vans. They changed the way the crews were trained, emphasizing the geometry of prediction rather than just drill. Then they went to the Isle of Grain, a desolate marshland in Kent, to conduct live fire trials. They broke down the firing cycle into milliseconds. They realized that the fuses on the shells were being set slightly late because of the physical time it took a man to turn a wrench. They calculated the exact delay and adjusted the predictors to compensate. The result? By 1941, the number of rounds required to bring down a plane dropped from 20,000 to 4,000. They had increased the lethality of the air defense system by 500%. They hadn't invented a new gun. They had just optimized the algorithm of the old one. But perhaps the most counterintuitive discovery, the one that truly highlights the genius of operations research, came from a biologist named Cecil Gordon. His assignment was RAF Coastal Command maintenance. By 1942, the RAF was flying thousands of sorties. The planes Liberators, Sunderlands, Halifaxes were complex machines. The standard procedure was rigorous. After every 50 hours of flying time, a bomber was pulled off the line for a scheduled maintenance overhaul. The mechanics would strip it down, check every valve, tighten every bolt, and put it back together. The commanders viewed this as prudent. It was preventative medicine. If you take care of the plane takes care of you. Gordon, the geneticist, looked at the data. He plotted a graph of aircraft failures versus time since last overhaul. If the maintenance was working, the graph should have shown a low failure rate immediately after the overhaul, slowly rising as the plane got dirty and worn out. But the graph showed the exact opposite. The failure rate was highest immediately after the 50-hour overhaul. A plane that had just come out of the shop was statistically more likely to break down than a plane that had been flying for 49 hours. Gordon realized the terrifying truth of mechanical intervention. Every time a human touches a complex machine, there is a non-zero probability of error. A mechanic strips a thread. He drops a washer into the intake. He over-tightens a wire. He creates a fault where none existed. By mandating a full strip down every 50 hours, the RAF was effectively sabotaging its own fleet. They were taking perfectly healthy aircraft and inducing infant mortality failures by taking them apart. Gordon proposed a radical idea. If it isn't broken, don't fix it. He recommended doubling the maintenance interval. He argued that they should only fix what was reported as faulty, rather than stripping the whole engine on a schedule. The RAF engineering officers were apoplectic. They accused the scientists of being reckless. They said planes would fall out of the sky. They said Gordon was a biologist who didn't know a spark plug from a propeller. But the shortage of aircraft was so critical that they agreed to a trial. They applied Gordon's planned maintenance schedule to a few squadrons. The results were undeniable. The number of serviceable aircraft available for patrol increased by 60%. The failure rate dropped. It became known as the Waddington effect, named after C.H. Waddington, the head of the section. By simply telling the mechanics to stop fixing things that weren't broken, the circus effectively gave the RAF hundreds of free bombers. This is the core of the operations research revolution. It wasn't about heroism. It wasn't about new gadgets. It was about looking at the data without the bias of tradition. It was about realizing that a black plane is visible in the day, that a shallow depth charge kills more subs, and that overmaintenance kills airplanes. However, the circus was about to face its biggest challenge, not from the Germans, but from the British establishment itself. The logic of operations research was about to collide with the emotional desire for revenge. The subject was area bombing, and the antagonist was the most powerful man in the Royal Air Force, Bomber Harris. To understand this conflict, we have to look at the exchange rate. In economics, an exchange rate tells you what your currency is worth. In war, it tells you what your life is worth. Blackett believed that every military operation could be reduced to a calculation of input versus output. How many man-hours does it take to build a bomber? How many German man-hours does that bomber destroy when it drops a bomb? If the cost of the bomber is higher than the damage it inflicts, you are losing the war, even if you are winning the battle. In 1942, the British government, urged on by Lord Cherwell, Churchill's scientific advisor, decided that the best way to win the war was to dehouse the German population. They would carpet bomb German cities, destroying worker housing to break morale. Cherwell produced a report claiming that strategic bombing would destroy the German economy. Blackett read the report. He checked the math, and he concluded that Cherwell was hallucinating. Blackett calculated that Cherwell had overestimated the damage of a ton of bombs by a factor of 6. He argued that area bombing was an inefficient waste of resources. He pointed out that a bomber over the Atlantic, saving a merchant ship full of oil and food, was worth infinitely more to the war effort than a bomber over Berlin, destroying a few row houses. He wrote a dissenting paper. He argued that the exchange rate of anti-submarine warfare was superior. A liberator in the Bay of Biscay might sink a U-boat that would otherwise sink 10,000 tons of Allied shipping. That same liberator bombing Hamburg might destroy a few factories that the Germans would repair in a week. This put Blackett on a collision course with Arthur Bomber Harris, the head of Bomber Command. Harris was a believer in the knockout blow. He hated the idea of diverting his precious heavy bombers to defensive duties like patrolling the ocean. He called the scientists amateur strategists and defeatists. The argument raged in the corridors of Whitehall. It wasn't just a debate about tactics. It was a debate about the soul of the war. Harris wanted to punish Germany. Blackett wanted to optimize victory. In the end, the compromise saved Britain. The Very Long Range, VLR, liberators were finally released to Coastal Command. They closed the air gap in the mid-Atlantic, the area where U-boats had been immune to air attack. The moment the air gap closed, the U-boat war was effectively over. The wolf packs had nowhere to hide. The exchange rate had swung decisively in the Allies' favor. Blackett had been right. The math had been right. But the legacy of Blackett's circus isn't just in the U-boats they sank or the planes they fixed. It's in the way we think about problems today. Before Blackett, war was considered an art. Generals relied on coup de will, the stroke of the eye, the intuition of the genius. After Blackett, war became a science. It became a process of probability, logistics, and optimization. When you look at a modern supply chain with its just-in-time delivery, you are looking at the descendants of Cecil Gordon's maintenance schedules. When you look at the way Internet protocols route traffic around congestion, you are seeing the echoes of the convoy size calculations. The civilian scientists prove that in the industrial age, you cannot feel your way to victory. You have to calculate it. The Germans built magnificent machines. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece. The V-2 rocket was a technological marvel. But they lost. They lost because they let their ideology override their arithmetic. They built weapons they couldn't fuel, and they fought battles they couldn't sustain. The Allies won because they weaponized the humble, boring, unromantic power of the spreadsheet. They realized that a 25-foot depth charge setting was more powerful than a battleship. They realized that a white airplane was deadlier than a black one. They realized that the path to Berlin didn't just go through the beaches of Normandy. It went through the chalkboard of a shabby office in Northwood, where a group of biologists and physicists turned the chaos of war into a solvable equation. While the scientists were winning the war of technology in the Bay of Biscay, they were losing a war of politics in London. The conflict was centered on a single precious resource, the 4-engine heavy bomber. By 1942, the British government was divided into two camps. On one side was Air Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris and Winston Churchill's personal scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell. They believed the only way to win the war was to burn German cities to the ground. They called it strategic bombing. On the other side were Patrick Blackett and the Royal Navy. They argued that the war would be lost in the main Atlantic long before it could be won in Berlin. They needed long-range aircraft to patrol the convoy routes, specifically the air gap in the mid-Atlantic, where U-boats hunted with impunity. This wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was a battle of mathematics. And at the center of it was a document that became infamous in the history of operations research, the Dehousing Paper. In March 1942, Lord Cherwell presented a memorandum to the Prime Minister. It was a cold, calculated argument for the destruction of civilian morale. Cherwell used data from the German bombing of British cities to estimate the damage a sustained RAF campaign could inflict on Germany. He calculated that if the RAF focused entirely on bombing German worker housing, they could dehouse 1/3 of the entire German population within 15 months. He argued this would break the enemy's will to fight. To achieve this, Cherwell demanded that every available heavy bomber be given to Bomber Command. He explicitly argued against diverting aircraft to Coastal Command for anti-submarine duties. Patrick Blackett read the paper. He took out his slide rule, and he dismantled it. Blackett realized that Cherwell had manipulated the data. Cherwell had assumed that every bomber would find its target. He had assumed that German housing was as flammable as British housing. He had assumed a constant rate of operational efficiency. Blackett recalculated the numbers and found that Cherwell had overestimated the potential damage by a factor of 6. But Blackett didn't stop there. He introduced a concept that is now a staple of economics and game theory, the exchange rate. He compared the yield of a bomber used over Germany versus a bomber used over the Atlantic. If a Liberator bomber flies over Berlin, it might drop 4 tons of bombs. Statistically, in 1942, most of those bombs would miss the target. The damage to the German war effort was negligible, perhaps a few hundred man-hours of repair work. However, if that same Liberator flies over the mid-Atlantic, its mere presence forces a U-boat to dive. A U-boat that is forced to dive loses its mobility. It cannot chase a convoy. It cannot attack. Blackett calculated that for every U-boat sighted by an aircraft, a specific number of merchant ships were saved. He proved that a single VLR, very long range, Liberator operating in the air gap saved, on average, 6 merchant ships for every dozen sorties flown. Those 6 ships carried 30,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and food enough to supply an army division for a month. The math was irrefutable. A bomber was worth infinitely more protecting the supply line than it was destroying German row houses. Blackett wrote, "The first duty of the Air Force is to ensure that the Army and the Air Force can exist." The argument was bitter. Harris called the scientists amateur strategists and accused them of defeatism. But the logic of the exchange rate eventually reached the highest levels of the War Cabinet. Slowly, reluctantly, the Air Ministry began to release the VLR Liberators to Coastal Command. It was just in time, because in May 1943, the U-boat arm was preparing its death blow. The turning point of the entire naval war can be pinned down to a single week, the first week of May 1943. The battleground was Convoy Ons 5. Ons 5 was a slow convoy of 43 merchant ships bound for North America. It was defended by Escort Group B7, led by Commander Peter Gretton, a man who had embraced the new scientific methods of anti-submarine warfare. Against them, Admiral Dunitz deployed unprecedented force. He massed 2 wolf packs, Mies and Amsel, totaling nearly 40 U-boats. His orders were to annihilate the convoy. He believed that if he could overwhelm the escorts with sheer numbers, he could massacre the merchant ships at will. This battle was the ultimate test of everything Blackett's circus had worked for. The large convoy theory, the 25-foot depth charge setting, the centimetric radar, the hedgehog. As the sun set on May 4th, the U-boats attacked. In previous years, a wolf-pack attack was a chaotic slaughter. U-boats would slip inside the escort screen, fire torpedoes at point-blank range, and escape on the surface. But this time, the variables had changed. The moment the U-boats surfaced to attack in the dark, they were painted by the new Type 271 centimetric radar on the escort ships. The Germans, relying on their METOX receivers to detect the older radar, saw nothing. They thought they were invisible. Suddenly, out of the fog, a British destroyer would charge them. The U-boats were forced to crash dive. This is where the new weaponry came into play. In the past, a submerged U-boat was safe if it could get deep enough. But the escorts of Group B7 were equipped with the Hedgehog. The Hedgehog was a spigot mortar that fired 24 contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, which had to be dropped off the stern, meaning the ship had to pass over the U-boat and lose sonar contact, the Hedgehog allowed the escort to attack while still tracking the target. The math of the Hedgehog was brutal. With depth charges, the kill probability was roughly 5% per attack. With the Hedgehog, it jumped to nearly 25%. Throughout the night of May 5th and the morning of May 6th, the U-boats tried to close in. Time and again, they were detected by radar, forced down, and hammered by Hedgehogs and shallow-set depth charges. The Raspberry Maneuver, a tactical search pattern developed by the Western Approach's tactical unit based on OR analysis, was used to ruthless effect. When a merchant ship was torpedoed, the escorts didn't just randomly search. They executed a precise, geometrically calculated sweep of the area behind the convoy, where the probability of catching the U-boat was highest. The result was a catastrophe for the Kriegsmarine. In a single night, the escorts of Ons 5 sank 6 U-boats. Another 5 were so badly damaged they had to abort. 2 more collided in the confusion. Admiral Dunitz watched the reports coming into his headquarters in Paris with growing horror. He was losing submarines faster than he could sink ships. The exchange rate had inverted. For the first time in the war, it was costing the Germans more to launch an attack than the Allies paid to defend it. On May 24, 1943, Dunitz sent a message that effectively ended the Battle of the Atlantic. Losses too high. Operations in the North Atlantic suspended. He later wrote in his memoirs, "We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic." He blamed new enemy detection devices. He didn't realize that the true weapon wasn't just the radar or the mortar. It was the mathematical optimization of their use. The Allies hadn't just outfought him, they had outcalculated him. But the work of the Operational Research Section wasn't limited to the sea. They also revolutionized the air war in ways that are still studied today. One of the most striking examples of counterintuitive thinking came from the analysis of armor plating on bombers. Early in the war, the RAF and USAAF wanted to increase the survival rates of their bombers. They looked at the planes returning from missions over Germany. They mapped the bullet holes. They found that the wings and the fuselage were riddled with flak and machine gun fire. The cockpit and the engines, however, rarely had bullet holes. The military conclusion was obvious. We need to put more armor on the wings and the fuselage, because that's where they are getting it. It was common sense. It was also dead wrong. A statistician named Abraham Wald, working with the American Statistical Research Group, a counterpart to Blackett's Circus, looked at the data and realized the military was suffering from survivorship bias. They were only looking at the planes that came back. The reason the returning planes had holes in the fuselage was that a plane could take a hit in the fuselage and still fly. The reason they saw no holes in the engines or the cockpit was that planes hit in those areas never came back. They crashed in Germany. Wald recommended the exact opposite of the military's plan. Put the armor where the bullet holes aren't. They reinforced the engines and the cockpits. Survival rates improved immediately. It was a triumph of statistical inference over visual evidence. It taught the military that what you do and see is often more important than what you do see. By 1944, operations research had become embedded in every aspect of the Allied war machine. It was used to calculate the optimal fuse settings for anti-aircraft shells against the 5-to-1 flying bombs, the proximity fuse, or VT fuse, which increased kill rates from 24% to 79%. It was used to determine the optimal number of rounds to fire from a tank to ensure a kill. It was even used to plan the D-Day invasion supply chains. The legacy of Blackett's Circus is difficult to overstate. They did not win the war alone. The bravery of the sailors, airmen, and soldiers did that. But they ensured that that bravery wasn't wasted. They ensured that the tools of war were used at their maximum theoretical efficiency. Patrick Blackett, the socialist pacifist who became the architect of U-boat destruction, eventually won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1948 not for his war work, which remained classified for decades, but for his work on cosmic rays. But his greatest contribution to humanity might have been the demonstration that science belongs in the operations room, not just the laboratory. The circus proved that war is not an art. It is a process. It is a system of inputs and outputs, probabilities and distributions. And like any system, it can be hacked. They hacked the Battle of the Atlantic. They hacked the air war. And in doing so, they saved Western civilization, 1 decimal point at a time. When we look at the modern world, at the algorithms that route our internet traffic, the logistics systems that deliver our packages, the risk models that run our banks, we are looking at the children of Blackett's Circus. We live in a world optimized by the methods they invented in the dark days of 1941. The admirals had the ships, the generals had the guns, but the professors had the math. And in the end, the math won.